Right, so this is a collaboration between the University of Huddersfield, the Università degli Studi di Brescia, and Simplify Limited. Now, we all know that for using planning in real-world applications, well, of course, we need a very good planning engine, we need a great and a very operational domain model, but we also need to have a problem instance which represent the current state of the world and can help us to reach a goal. And this issue of creating the instance is exacerbated in real-time applications where you need to create the problem instance online and as quickly as possible in order to solve a problem. There is automation that can be put in place for creating the problem instance, but during a case study that I'm going to describe you in the next slide, we faced that there are quite a lot of issues around the generation of problem instances. So we are discussing here some lessons learned, and we are highlighting some areas where we believe the planning community should focus in order to better support the use of planning in real-world applications. And our case study is, of course, traffic control or urban traffic control, where we are using PDDL plus planning for generating traffic signal strategies to respond to unexpected or unusual circumstances. We are focusing on a major corridor in Kirklees. So in this region here, I can't tell you exactly which corridor for some privacy and safety reasons, but this area is quite interesting because, well, it gets a lot of traffic commuters which are going to work in the town center, and also it is between two major highways, M62 and M1, and so you have a lot of cross traffic which is going between the two highways. And differently from previous work, from us and from other people working in planning or scheduling for urban traffic control, we don't have a traffic simulation model. So what we need to do is to exploit the current systems which are in charge of generating traffic signal strategies, which are Scoot, and exploiting their sensors for the purposes of creating our own models. And this is an example of a PDDL plus problem model that we've been using and we are using in here. So we can completely specify the status of each junction in terms of what stage is active, what is the sequence of stages in there, for how long a stage has been on, what is the intergreen time between two stages, so when you have nothing on green, which is going on in the junction. If the junction is controllable, then you can specify what are the legal traffic movements between rings that are connected to the junction, and what is the expected amount of traffic moving around during the period that we are simulating. And of course, mix among green time, capacities of the length of the road, the number of lanes, and these sort of things, and the current occupancy of the road. So these are all the information that you need for fully describing the initial status of a network. And then, of course, you can specify a goal. And that initial state, which is what we're focusing on, which is what you need to create on the fly for solving problems online, is composed by static and dynamic data. Static means that it's data that you don't need to create for every instance, but remains the same for the region, like the structure of the network, so the topology of the links, the capacity of the links, the junctions, their position, their stages, etc., intergreen timings, and per legal traffic movements. And then you have dynamic data, which needs instead to be created every time. Average traffic flows, so the turn rates that we have seen before, inside the region and on the boundaries of the region, occupancy of the links at the initial time, so how many vehicles are in there, current state of the junction, and we also have a bonus track, which is, since we are dealing with unusual or unexpected circumstances, the way in which these circumstances are affecting the traffic in the region. So that is distinguished between static and dynamic data. And this is the sort of data flow that we put in place. So we have, as we said before, Scoot sensors, and the Scoot system creates over time some messages which are giving you a fairly complete overview of the status of a system and of a network, or at least of a part of a network which is controlled by a specific Scoot agent. And this information is stored into the Astrid database, and from here you can extract it to generate the dynamic data, that of course needs some processing, and the static data, which also needs some additional input as well. And to be honest, for the dynamic data, you don't really use the Astrid database because the Astrid database makes the data available after a few minutes. So you can't use that for real time. In this case, you can just overtake, let's say, the Astrid system and connect directly to the Scoot sensors, but the idea remains the same. And so that, I mean, it took quite a a while to us to generate the data flow, and but did we learn something in the middle? And there are a number of points that we are discussing in the paper. I don't have the time to go through all of them, so I just picked up 3 that I believe can be of interest for this presentation and for fostering some discussion at the workshop. So the first one is about data interpretation. So data which is pulled from different sources may require different interpretations. This is not only in terms of measurement units, but can vary and actually varies quite a lot with regards to the data that we are considering, but also with regards to the semantic of the data. And the interpretation is usually provided as documentation, but again, the documentation tend to be for hard to read for non-experts of the domain. And specifically for this project, we have issues with what is called the M37 files that tells you what is the sequence of stages and the length of them according to what the Scoot system decided. And if you, for each line, basically it's telling you the time of the day, the junction which is in control, and the stage that was activated, the intergreen, for how long the green has been on, and what is the total time between green and intergreen. And you can see in here that, or actually what happened to us is that you don't know if this line is describing something which is going to happen or that has just ended. And of course, we picked up the wrong interpretation, so something which is going to happen. Instead, the Scoot system is telling you that in the past 45 seconds, sorry, this stage 1 was on. And this is having quite a significant impact, of course, on the way in which you interpret the data and on the way in which you create initial state or validations. So the take-home message from here is nothing really too related to planning, but just make your Gantt chart robust enough to absorb data-related delays, because there will be if you're dealing with real-world problems. Another point that is instead much more related to planning is the verification of the initial state. Now, we all know that PDDL is not great in providing you constraints for making sure that an initial state is valid or not. You actually can't really do that. And this is exacerbated again in PDDL Plus, where you have numbers and when you have possibly continuous processes, etc., etc. In our case, for instance, we were having issues with mean and max values which were not correctly related, or flows which are negative and that sort of things. And in this specific case, what we did was developing some ad hoc techniques for parsing the specific issues that we observed. There is the need for most robust approaches, potentially domain independent, that can look at the domain model, can look at the initial problem instance, and tell you if there is something which is likely to be an issue, at least. And finally, there is the validation point. Now, validation is crucial in real-world application for 2 aspects. One, of course, because you want to check that your generated plans make sense, at least with regards to your model. But secondly, you want to simulate real-world plans in the planning models to make sure that your planning model is adequate and accurate to represent what is going on in the real world. And on this regards, typical validation tools provide quite limited support because most of the cases they tell you if a plan is valid or not, and you need to dig a bit into them in order to create some more verbose output. But also they tend not to support very much debugging. So specifically, what would be needed is something which is telling you not only that a plan failed, but why. And some of the validators actually do that. And besides the why, how did things go up to that point? And maybe telling you how you can fix that or what is likely to be a solution. And of course, in PDDL Plus, validation is making much worse by events and processes which are not included in plans. So just for concluding, I know this has not been rocket science for all of you which has been working on real-world applications, but the idea of this case study was to provide you a sort of overview of some of the lessons that we have learned particularly with regards to knowledge acquisitions, and some of the areas where we believe there is the need for some work from the planning community. Some issues that we faced came directly from the PDDL language, and so we are forced to find out shortcuts in order to avoid that. And so for concluding, with regards to the future work, what we would like to do is, of course, focus on verification and validation, and with a particular attention given to domain-independent techniques, which are based on the characteristics of a model, so that can be fruitful also for the rest of the community. And that is all. Thank you very much for your attention.